As you know, my name is Chief Mack. I'm the Cadet Deputy Commander over at Milwaukee Composite Squadron. This month is Suicide Awareness Month. So Rabbi Grossman has asked me to, share my experience with suicide and just talk to you about my experiences and what I went through. As a preface to the story, before I get into it, I've never experienced any suicidal thoughts myself, and I would consider myself a pretty happy person overall. So that being said, let's get into the story. So as you can see, this is my father on my left, and then me and my sister and my mother. This was on a vacation to Yellowstone, Illinois. Or sorry, Yellowstone National Park. So up until third or fourth grade, my life was pretty normal. But in I think it was in third grade, I was sitting in the car with my parents, and my mom turned and looked at me, and she went, your father and I are getting a divorce. And at the time, that was the biggest event to happen in my life, and I was distraught being a third grader. I was like, oh, life is going to be so different. Having divorced parents, I never thought that this would happen to me. Little did I know, everything turned out pretty much all right. Every weekend, I would visit my father at his apartment in Chicago. And my family actually moved from Glenview to Lake Zurich, which is where we reside now. So here's a photo of my father and I in Chicago. So we'd spend our time in Chicago biking around, playing chess, watching the Formula One race, getting food, and watching NFL. We were big Dallas Cowboys fans. And I spent every weekend with him, and me and my dad over the course of this time got very, very close together. It went like this for about 3 or 4 years, and then on May 15th, 2016, I was FaceTiming my father, and we were talking about what we were going to do that weekend. And when we were ending the call, I ended as I always did, just saying like, love you, Dad, see ya. And he responded, love you, Jake, bye. Little did I know, later that night, my father would commit suicide. I'm not going to get into the exact reasons why my father committed suicide. Essentially, he had big skeletons in his closet and things that haunted him from his past. And eventually, they figuratively fell out of the closet, you could say. And perhaps out of guilt or fear or just embarrassment, he decided to end it. So the day after he killed himself, my family found out, specifically my mom first. And I remember when she broke the news to me like it was yesterday. A few days prior, around May 14th, one of my Xbox controllers was getting really old, and I needed a new one. So I went to my mom and I asked her, are there any chores I can do? I need a new Xbox controller because the one I have is dying on me. And she was like, yeah, we'll figure something out soon. Just let me do some work stuff first. So then May 16th, she comes home, and I see her get out of the car because I'm looked through the window, and I saw her walk up, and she had a brand new Xbox controller in her hand. And I remember thinking in that moment, just, wow, this is like the best day ever. I didn't even have to do anything. I didn't have to clean my room. I didn't have to do any laundry. I didn't have to do any dishes. And look, she brought home a brand new Xbox controller. This is amazing. I didn't have to lift a finger. But when she walked through the door, I could tell something was up. But me being in 6th grade at the time, I didn't think about it. I was too focused on, the good thing that happened to me rather than my mom being a little sulky. I just assumed that she was tired from work and let that be that. So eventually she handed the controller to me, hugged me, and then asked my sister and I to sit down at the kitchen table. So my sister walks down the stairs, and we both sit at the kitchen table. And I remember the first words that came out of her mouth were, "Daddy is dead." I didn't register it immediately. Initially, I was sifting through my mental registry of celebrities, and I was trying to look for one that had the name Daddy because, I read the words, I understood the words, and in the back of my mind, I knew, is she talking about my father? But I didn't want to believe it. But unfortunately, as I started to realize over the few seconds after she said that, she confirmed my worst fears by following it up with, your father committed suicide last night. The rest of that day is a bit of a blur. I just remember a lot of crying. My sister, she started crying her eyes out, and she ran outside and started running down our driveway crying. And then she ended up sitting on the stairs outside of her house, and she just cried for a long time. I remember after crying with my sister for a little bit, I went to my room, and I just kind of silently cried in my room for about an hour. The rest of the days following were mostly just family coming over to pay their condolences to myself, my sister, and my mom. My cousins, they came over. They tried to take our mind off of things by inviting us to mini golf or playing football with us or just generally being around us, so we didn't have to focus on the fact that my father had committed suicide. For months after, I was in a very sulky mood. I didn't have the drive to do anything. I had many passions. My father and I shared, one of which was aviation, and the other of which was racing and football. So here's some photos of that. Hopefully you can see. So my father and I would visit Oshkosh every year, um, and he would take me to all sorts of air shows, and we especially loved historical aviation because my grandfather served on the USS Saratoga in 1942, and he actually became one of the first cap pilots after he left the Navy in 1944, which I didn't actually know about until after I joined CAP and I found one of my grandfather's old photos. So it's a small world. But here's me right after I got my go-karting license. I had won my first race. I was super proud and I wanted to look really cool, so I stood up nice and straight and looked very stern. Here's some other photos of me with my racing coach at the time, John. And I had just gotten this helmet for my birthday. And I got this blue helmet and this blue racing suit. But after my father died, I never really raced again. I stopped focusing. I stopped watching races like my dad and I would every weekend. I stopped watching football. Here's me in some Dallas Cowboys merchandise. But I just lost the drive to do almost everything. My grades in school started slipping, but I was still getting decent grades. I was still in the honors classes, but I just didn't have the drive because I didn't think it really mattered at that point. Luckily, I had a great group of friends who convinced me to join wrestling and other extracurricular activities. And in seventh grade, things started to turn around a lot. Like I said, I joined wrestling, and I decided sometime in seventh grade that I would pursue becoming a naval aviator, and that's been my dream for several years now. About a year later, one of my mom's friends suggested that I join CAP, and because I was already looking up ways on how to become a naval aviator, I kind of jumped on the opportunity to join Civil Air Patrol, and I've been in here for 3 years now. And also, when I was starting high school, I still had a little bit of the lack of drive to do anything in school, but my cousin Peter really helped me. He encouraged me to keep me on the straight and narrow. He made sure I stayed off drugs. He made sure I hung out with the right people, and he always checked up on me and my grades to see how I was doing in school. And his encouragement really helped me become the best student I could be and recover from my father's suicide. So going off of the idea of kind of rebounding from something that happens to you, something detrimental and something life-changing, I was at the National Character and Leadership Symposium in Colorado Springs at the Air Force Academy with Chaplain Grossman and his son, Levi Grossman, former cadet colonel. And there we saw lots of speakers, but one really stood out to me, and I'll talk about him in a second, but let me show you some photos. So this is me with Levi. This is at the Garden of the Gods. We were climbing rocks and having a good time. Here's another photo. Me at the Air Force Academy in my flight jacket, which I actually inherited from my father. And, one of the speakers we saw there were plenty of great speakers and plenty of things I still hold very dear to my heart. But one of them that really struck a chord with me like no other talk has struck a chord with me before was a man named Joel Thorneeb. Now, Joel was a former cadet at the Academy. And after he graduated, he became an F-15 pilot. And he served as an F-15 pilot for about 15 years. And then somewhere in there, he developed cancer. But he didn't know about it until it was stage 4. He had a very rare form of cancer that very few people survived. And when he was diagnosed, he immediately went through chemo. And he kind of, his whole career was grounded, and he was stuck in the hospital going through chemotherapy. And similar to me, after my father's suicide, he spent the first months and the first decent bit just sulking and feeling sorry for himself, and he didn't have the drive to do anything because he felt like nothing really mattered at that point. He was at his lowest point, and he felt like he was in a hole that he would never be able to climb out of. But through the help of family, through the help of people he met that inspired him. He managed to fight his way, and you can't beat stage 4 cancer, it's always there, but he managed to beat it enough that it no longer became the forefront of his life. And he kind of dubbed this idea in this wonderful 40-minute talk, which I'm going to sum up really quickly. He called the idea survivor's obligation. And what he defined survivor's obligation is he said it was the idea that when you're at your lowest point and when you feel like no one cares and there's nowhere for you to go and you're faced with like an illness or a challenge or some form of adversity that you feel is unbeatable, you have an obligation to yourself to push through with all of the might you have and live a life that you're happy living. And that being said, if it was super easy to just realize, oh, I need to live a good life and push through any adversity, depression, suicide, those would be much smaller issues than they are. So an important step to this is getting help. This fight, you're not going to win this fight alone. For Joel, he had his wife, his family. He had very important people that he met at the hospital, which really inspired him to push harder. And he had, for me, I had great friends that helped build up my resolve, which allowed me to push through my father's suicide, as well as my cousin who made sure that I kept on the straight and narrow and developed goals for myself that I could, work for and achieve. But at the same time, you want your support structure, but you also want to be wary of other people that are also going through these similar issues. If you see people fighting a battle that they feel is unwinnable, or you see signs that they may be going through something that they feel like is insurmountable, don't be afraid to offer a helping hand. Even if they'll say that they can handle it themselves or that they don't need any help, they're most likely lying. A lot of people these days don't go to others about their problems because they're afraid of being a burden. We talked about ACE, ask, care, escort, and know that the escort step is crucial. I know we've already emphasized this multiple times, but really, if you know that they are thinking about committing suicide or that they've attempted suicide and they're still thinking about it, you need to get them help, no matter the cost. They will try and threaten you sometimes by saying things like, if you tell my parents, I'll cut myself, or if you tell my teacher or the school, I'll never forgive you. Know that these threats are mostly empty. Normally they won't do anything about it, but if you feel like they do, it's okay to promise them that you won't tell anyone and get them help regardless. It will be a betray of their trust, and they will hate you for a little bit, but trust me, they will forgive you faster than you realize. And to emphasize this, actually, just a few weeks ago, even after Rabbi Grossman asked me to start thinking about a talk I could give for this month, one of my friends, my dear friends who's in wrestling with me, attempted suicide. And he hid it from everyone except his girlfriend. And his girlfriend came to me crying, being like, listen, you're like his best friend. I don't know what to do. He attempted last night, but luckily he's okay. I don't think I can handle it anymore. He needs to talk to other people about this. And first of all, she was betraying his trust by even telling me, because he didn't want me to know. He would come to wrestling with cuts on his hands and fingernails, and he would just say that he wrestled someone with long nails and he got scratched, or he'd come with cuts on his arms and he'd be like, oh yeah, I was wrestling a guy and he scratched me really hard and I started bleeding. So he would say things like that to kind of subvert my expectations, so I didn't know what was going on. So him and I were talking about it, and we were talking about getting him help, and he didn't want help. Not that he didn't feel like he could beat it himself, but he didn't have the drive to get help. He was numb to the pain at that point. He didn't want to burden anyone. Even just me knowing about it, he profusely apologized through our entire talk. Every second sentence of his was him saying, I'm sorry that you have to know this. I'm so sorry. You shouldn't have never have known this. This should have just been my issue. And after talking for a while, at the end of our talk, I offered to call his parents, and he said, if you call my mom, I will never forgive you. But at the end of our talk, he couldn't promise that he wasn't going to do anything. I said, promise me that you're not going to do anything rash. We'll talk again on Wednesday, and we'll figure out a plan for you to get help. And he said, look, I don't know. So at that point, we hung up the call. It was too late at night to call his parents, so I woke up the next day. I called his mother, and we talked about it. And it turns out that his parents knew that he had attempted suicide before, but right before he attempted again, he went out of his way to tell his mother that he had been doing better and that he didn't feel like he needed help anymore. They were considering sending him to a therapist. He had seen a psychiatrist. He was on medication, but he had told his parents that, hey, I'm doing much better than I was. I don't think I'm going to be needing this stuff anymore. So who would have known what would have happened if I didn't call his parents and just let his parents, think that he was doing really well when he was sitting in a pit alone, kind of deteriorating as a person until he would have decided to kill himself. So I could stop the talk there. I've talked about my experiences with suicide and the importance of ACE, but I wanted to talk about one more thing before I make my closing statements and hand it back to Rabbi Grossman. And this is the idea that I see from a lot of kids my age, especially. And it's the idea that no one cares about you, or that you're kind of in this alone and that your parents don't understand. And, the idea that you could just disappear tomorrow and no one would know, no one would realize. And this is just simply untrue. People care monstrously, and you just don't realize it. And to illustrate this point, I'm going to talk about my sister. Now, while I was very close with my father, my sister's relationship with him was, to put it simply, extremely complicated. Here's a photo of my sister and I at an animal science camp. I think this is back before our parents got divorced. But her relationship with my father was, I would say, on the borderline hatred. Of course, there was still that familial bond between them, and at the end of the day, they were still father and daughter. But there was very much a sense of resentment from my sister to my father, and my father tried to be there for my sister, but a lot of the times he just wasn't enough. My sister came out as LGBTQ in middle school, and she was bullied for it a lot, so she developed severe depression and anxiety, and she's attempted suicide multiple times, one of which actually I've had to step in and stop. She went to a field and she slit her wrists open and she was bleeding out in the field. And she actually called my mother crying, and we had to go pick her up and call an ambulance. So people care more than you think, because when my father committed suicide, you'd think my sister, of all people, wouldn't care. She hated my father. She resented my father with almost every fiber in her body. She visited him maybe every month or two, and she probably hadn't said "I love you" to my father in excess of a year, if not multiple years. But when my father committed suicide, she was hit harder than I ever could. She still visits his grave every year, and she was hit really hard. She kind of fell into a pit similarly like I did, but while I was managed to crawl myself out, after a few months or a year, I started to get better and on the uphill. She stayed on the downhill for multiple years. Luckily, she's gotten a good job now as like a vet's assistant at an animal hospital, which is one of her dreams. She's always loved veterinary things and animals. So she's been on the uphill lately, and I'm extremely proud of her for that. But she was in a dark place for several years, mainly due to my father's suicide, even though their relationship wasn't great. So the idea that someone doesn't care because, they're not actively keeping up with you, or, they're just not 100% there for you, is just ridiculous. There are 7 billion people in this world, and it's ridiculous to think that not a single person cares, especially those that are close to you. Now, I'm no motivational speaker, and I've only lived 17 short years on this planet. But if there's anything that you all can take away from this talk, it's that you have a duty to yourself to push forward whatever the cost and live a life worth living. You can never know when life will throw you a curveball or try and push you down. What you do know is that with enough perseverance, enough grit, and enough fortitude, you can win this fight, and you never have to fight it alone. If anyone is dealing with a similar issue to me, they have a suicide in the family, they're having suicidal thoughts, or they know someone who's suicidal, I'll put my email and my phone number in the chat, and contact me anytime. I'm free. I'll make time for you. Even if I'm not free, I guarantee you I'll make time and we will talk. Just thank you so much for listening. In fact, I didn't know the reason my father committed suicide until I would say about freshman year of high school. I'd always assumed it had something to do with money, because my father worked in business, and our family started really struggling, like as a family unit, around 2008 when the housing market crashed. But I didn't know about any of the the skeletons in his closet, as I talked about. So actually, for a little bit, when I was in like my darkest places right after he committed suicide, I kind of put a little bit of the blame on myself, because I remember thinking at the time, maybe if I wasn't born, they would have the extra money that would help them through the crisis. But now that I know the actual reason he killed himself, I don't think that way anymore. But at the time, that was a thought in my mind of like, maybe, if I just wasn't born, they would have the money and they would be able to live through this, and maybe my sister would still have a father. So
I want to thank you for extraordinary sharing and a very effective presentation. And I hope that what people take away from it, in addition to their own sense of perseverance and what it takes, what I take away from it, and I've seen this from my own experience, people don't realize just how devastating the suicide is to the people who are left behind. The rabbi said that it's a permanent solution to a temporary problem, but it can be a permanent pain to the people who care about you. And I would just hope that perhaps that might stick in some people's mind at a critical moment and might push them in another direction.